I'm Corinna Howard and this is the Monday Night Review. We're on episode 58 and I'm already going in with an apology because today we are going to Germany. My German pronunciation is not okay, I don't think. So I really apologise to anyone who's listening who is German, speaks German or has ears and doesn't want them to be violated by my terrible pronunciation. I'm feeling pretty smug today because we are having a heat wave. I use speech marks for that. We're just experiencing a British summer, which is rare. And usually I'd be in London where it's degrees hotter, no breeze, and London townhouses are often like ovens made of brick, really tall, crammed in next to each other. So the fact that I'm sitting in my office in the countryside where it's cool and breezy. I mean, it's hot outside, but yeah, I'm here in my bikini, which is also something that's very unlikely to happen ever. But it's hot enough and it's private enough that my fats are out. And yeah, happy summer, everyone. Today, as I said, we're taking a trip to Germany in the 1920s. This is a really famous case, and it's funny because quite often I'll shy away from doing things that I feel, oh God, every podcast does them. But there's a reason every podcast does them, and that's because some of the stories that you'll hear over and over again on like true crime or paranormal podcasts and things like that, they're just so fascinating. And I think to myself, well, I've listened to about 8 episodes about this and I listen to more. So today we're going to talk about Hinterkaifeck. So this is a murder story. There are kids involved. It's not too nitty gritty, but I will give you fair warning before we get to any of the bad stuff. Strange things were happening at the Gruber's farm, Hinterkaifeck. As the name implies, the farm was behind Hinter, the village of Kaifeck, 45 miles north of Munich in Germany. The family living in this isolated farm are 63-year-old Andreas Gruber, his wife Celia, their widowed 35-year-old daughter Victoria Gabriel, and her 2 children, Celia called Celie, and Joseph, who was 2, Celie's 7. They also had a maid who lived with them. Victoria's husband, Carl Gabriel, had been killed in the war in December 1914, declared dead at Arras, but no body had ever been found. Celia had inherited the farm when her first husband died, and a few years later she had married the young farmhand Andreas Gruber. Andreas was not a nice man, and there's a lot of talk about him and the whole family in the village. Celia had 2 children by her first marriage, and they move out as soon as possible. The Grubers have 3 daughters, but Victoria's the only one to survive Andreas's violence into adulthood. It's believed that the other 2 died from starvation and neglect. Andreas's proclivities for incest and abuse were frequently discussed, and a maid had actually caught him raping his 16-year-old daughter when she'd walked in, and a maid had caught him raping his daughter. She was 16 at the time and had reported it, and eventually Andreas and Victoria were both charged and convicted of incest. Victoria was given 1 month in prison, and Victoria was given 1 month in prison for her non-consensual part in her own abuse, and Andreas was given just a year. The law at the time would accuse and punish both parties, no matter what the situation was, in cases of incest, and as soon as their sentences were complete, they returned to Hinterkaifeck. Victoria had more recently been in a relationship with a neighbouring wealthy farmer, Lorenz Schlittenbauer, and they had become engaged. But when Victoria became pregnant in 1918, Schlittenbauer confronted Andreas, saying that the baby was the result of incest, and then Andreas threatened Schlittenbauer with a scythe. This is really hazy because both Victoria and Schlittenbauer refer to Joseph as their child, and eventually Schlittenbauer pays child support, but many believe that he's actually the son of Andreas and Victoria, and as soon as Schlittenbauer starts paying child support, she switches the guardianship over into Andreas's name. That same year, Schlittenbauer makes a formal complaint to the police saying that Andreas is the father of the baby, and Andreas is then in prison for 2 weeks until Schlittenbauer retracts his claim. And we don't know why he retracts this, but he had mentioned that it was because the Gruber family had paid him. So since this had all happened, Schlittenbauer had married another woman. So that's a little bit of a backstory. But in September 1929, the Gruber family maid handed in her notice. She'd been there for about 10 months, and she gave her reason for leaving. She believed the farm was haunted. She kept hearing strange sounds in the attic and feeling like she was being watched. Then in mid-March 1922, Andreas found a newspaper from Munich on the property. No one in the family had been to Munich or been into town, and so they weren't really sure where the newspaper could have come from. Eventually, Andreas concludes that the postman must have dropped it off in error instead of taking it to someone who was a subscriber, but they checked that out with the postman, and it turns out that no one in the area subscribes to that newspaper. Around the same time, one of the family's 2 house keys disappears. Again, no one has taken it anywhere. Nobody knows where it can have gone. Just days before the end of March, Andreas tells neighbours that he's found tracks in the snow leading from the nearby forest to the farm's machine building, which had also had its door lock broken. But what was really sinister, because there was loads of snow, these footprints were really defined, but there are no footprints leaving the building. Later that night, they hear footsteps in the attic, and Gruber goes up to have a look, but finds no one there. And he searches the building and doesn't really find anything suspicious, though he finds scratches on the lock to the tool shed, showing that someone's tried to get in. So he tells people about these goings on. Before his marriage to the older owner of the farm, Celia, he had been a very helpful neighbouring farmhand. So despite the fact that he was known to be abusing his daughter and he was known as a sort of miserly, mean man, he did speak to the neighbouring farmers. So he did tell several neighbours about these goings on, but he refused to accept any help, and he refused to report it to the police. Obviously, as we know, he has been in prison. He's probably not a big fan of the police. So on the afternoon of the 31st of March 1922, which is a Friday, the new maid, Maria Baumgartner, arrives at the farm. Her sister drops her off and doesn't stay long, and Maria goes upstairs. She meets the family. She takes all her things upstairs, and she's probably going to be doing some light work before she properly starts the next day. They haven't had a live-in maid for 6 months, so it's probably quite a lot for her to do. Celie was distressed at school that day, and she fell asleep in class, and when her teacher asked what was wrong, she explained that her grandfather, Andreas Gruber, had hit her mother Victoria the night before, and then her mother had run away through the snow into the forest and was missing for several hours. Victoria was eventually found slumped on a tree, and this had obviously been really distressing for little Celie. Now, from what we can tell, sometime in the late evening of the 31st of March, Victoria, her 7-year-old daughter Celie, and her parents Andreas and Celia were lured into the family barn through the stable, where they were murdered one at a time. The perpetrator or perpetrators used a mattock, which is a sort of hand tool. It looks a bit like a pickaxe, but it's used for digging and chopping, and yeah, it looks as sort of like a double-headed pickaxe. The killer then went into the house where, with the same murder weapon, he killed baby Joseph, who was asleep in his cot, and Maria Baumgartner in her room. On the 1st of April at 3 o'clock in the morning, the farmer and butcher Simon Reiflander was on his way home, and he sees two unknown figures at the edge of the forest towards Hinterkaifeck. And when the strangers see him, they turn around so their faces cannot be seen. Later, when he hears about the murder, he thinks it may be that these strangers were involved in some way. Later that day, on the 1st of April, coffee sellers Hans and Edouard Shirovsky arrive at Hinterkaifeck to take the Gruber's usual order. No one responds to the knocks at the door or the windows, and they walk around the yard, but they don't find anyone. But the only thing they notice that's a bit unusual is that the gate to the machine house is open. Now, we know that Andreas used to beat his wife and his daughter. He was also really controlling. They did used to go to church, but he had said to Victoria that she was never to get remarried, that she belonged to him. He was very strict about where they went. She sang in the choir, and so she was allowed to do that, and that's where she had her friends. But it would be really unusual for them all to be out of the farm, especially if they were expecting a delivery or someone to come and take an order. The family are noticeably absent at church on Sunday the 2nd of April. As I said, Victoria sang in the choir, so she was really missed. When Celie misses a few days of school, she misses Saturday school and then Monday, people get a bit concerned. She is often unwell, so the teacher leads them in a prayer for her wellness and then carry on, but it was noted. And then one of the neighbours who's passing Hinterkaifeck sees smoke coming from the chimney, and he goes to the house and he feels the oven's hot, but the smoke coming smells really acrid, like fabrics being burnt. And then he sees a man walking towards him holding a lantern up in front of his face that blinds this neighbour. And it's so sinister that he runs away. But as I said, Andreas Gruber's not a nice man, so I don't think they'd put it past him just being a bit of an arse. The postman also has a habit of delivering the post and putting it on the kitchen table. And when he goes to make his delivery on the Monday, which is the 3rd of April, he does notice that the mail is piling up, but the front door is open to the farm. So he thinks that the family must be around somewhere. On the 4th of April, Albert Hoffner goes to Hinterkaifeck to repair an engine on the food chopper he has prearranged with Andreas. So he arrives at the farm and waits for about an hour, but sees and hears nothing. He can hear the farm animals inside. They've got cows and pigs, and the dog is locked inside the barn. He can see a man some fields away, so he just assumes that that's a farmhand or Andreas, and decides to start working on his repair. Now, this repair takes about 4.5 hours. And when he's finished, he finds that the barn door is open and the dog is now tied up outside. The dog is very upset, barking and growling, and has a cut on its face. And so Albert goes to the farmhouse door, knocks, but there's no answer, and the door is locked. So he finds this a bit strange, that for all of that time, though there's obviously been someone around, they haven't come and spoken to him. He hasn't actually seen anyone. And so he goes to the nearest neighbour, and the nearest neighbour is Lorenz Schlittenbauer. So he says what has just happened, and he couldn't find anyone at the farm. So Schlittenbauer's not that fussed. At about 3:30 that afternoon, he sends his son Johann, who's 16, and his stepson Joseph, who's 9, to Hinterkaifeck to see if they can track any of the family down. And the boys come back and say they knocked on all the doors and the windows and they looked everywhere and they couldn't see anyone. So Schlittenbauer decides to go to the farm himself with 2 other neighbours. Michael Pohl, who had walked past and seen the man with the lantern and seen the smoking chimney and smelt the horrible smell, and Jacob Siegel. So they arrive at Hinterkaifeck and they enter the barn, where they find the bodies of Andreas, his wife, his daughter Victoria, and his granddaughter Celie. Weirdly, the bodies are kind of all piled up on top of each other under a scattering of hay, and Schlittenbauer immediately starts moving them. And the other 2 men say, "Stop, you shouldn't be handling the bodies, what are you doing?" And he says, "I'm looking for my son, I'm looking for my boy." So they were really surprised. He didn't seem fazed by the bodies. We're going to talk about the injuries later, but I'm going to give you a bit of a warning. But obviously, if he's in a panic looking for his child, that would explain it. But they say that he didn't ever seem panicked. He just seemed quite calm. So Schlittenbauer then goes into the house. The missing key, there's debate. Some say he uses the missing key. Some say that the missing key was already in the lock of the door. And then he leads them straight upstairs, where they find Maria Baumgartner hacked to death in her bedroom. Her suitcase is still on the bed, half packed. She's been covered with one of her sheets. And then baby Joseph is dead in the cot, covered with one of his mother's dresses. The men go on to search the kitchen. They find food missing, a piece of meat that they've obviously cured meat that they've kept in the pantry has recently been carved. The dog and the animals on the farm all look fed and looked after. And then when they go up into the attic, they find food scraps and fecal matter, human fecal matter. Now, Schlittenbauer sends the other 2 men to get the police, and while he waits, he decides he's going to feed the pigs. Again, that's kind of weird. Though, of course, if you're a farmer and you're worried, I can see how that might be a autopilot thing. Take care of the animals, make sure the animals are okay. But it does seem a little bit odd. So the police arrive. Inspector George Reingruber and his team are in charge of the investigation, and people begin to show up to the scene to see what's been going on. The Grubers are not very popular, so it becomes almost like a local Madame Tussauds, I guess. People just come up to stare at the body, and unfortunately they walk all over the crime scene. They go to the fridge to make snacks, and this and the fact that Schlittenbauer has moved the bodies and picked up some of items around the house makes the crime scene really hard to properly investigate. Now, the police first suspect the motive to be robbery. They interrogate a number of suspects from the surrounding villages, but when a large amount of money is found in the house, they kind of abandon the theory. It's clear that the perpetrator or perpetrators had stayed at the farm for several days. Someone had fed the cattle, eaten the entire supply of bread from the kitchen, and, as I said, recently cut meat in the pantry. So robbery was ruled out. This didn't look like they'd arrived to grab loads of stuff and then leave. Someone had been lurking about the house. With robbery ruled out, the police ran out of good suspects, except for one. We'll get to that in a minute. And despite repeated arrests, no murderer has ever been found, and the files were closed in 1955. Now, the town coroner comes up to perform the autopsies in the barn and confirms their causes of death. This is going to be a little bit graphic, so if you need to skip ahead, feel free. I'm going to try and keep it as medical as possible. So Mrs. Gruber has had her skull cracked with multiple blows to the head, and there's also signs that she has been strangled. Andreas has blood caked all over his face, which was described as shredded, and his cheekbones are sticking out of the flesh on his face. Victoria had also had her skull shattered, with signs that her face had been hit with a blunt object which left 9 star-shaped wounds on her head, and she also shows signs of strangulation. So originally they think that there must be 2 murder weapons because of these weird star-shaped marks on Victoria's face. Her daughter Celie had had her jaw shattered, and her face and neck were covered with gaping circular slashing wounds. Distressingly, though, her wounds were fatal, but she did not die immediately, and she was alive for a few hours after the attack and was found clutching handfuls of her hair with bald patches on her head, which just shows signs of terrible distress. Maria and Joseph seem to have died quickly. Maria suffered a number of blows to the head and face, while Joseph just had 1 wound on his face. The coroner believes that the 4 who had died in the barn had been lured in one by one, and said it seemed as if there were 2 murder weapons, as I say, one that's similar to a mattock and one that looks more like a piece of wood with a screw sticking out of it. And so for a while they believed that there would be at least 2 people involved in this murder. Weirdly, they then remove the heads of the family and send them, some cases say, to Munich for further investigation, but actually they were sent to a clairvoyant to try and get a read from them, and a few clairvoyants were allowed to handle them to see if they could give any insight into what happened. And one psychic came back claiming there were 2 killers and that the murder weapon, which they hadn't found, was hidden on the property. Distressingly, the heads were lost in World War II as the place that they were being held, which was in Nuremberg, was bombed. So the family are all buried without their heads. So there are loads of questions about this case. How are the family lured into the barn one by one? Victoria and her daughter are in their clothes. Andreas and Celia are in pyjamas, and that would suggest that Victoria and her daughter went out first, and then the parents went out later on. They did find a cow wandering free, so it could be that it had been let loose in the barn to lure them outside. And there are some theories that they could have heard an animal in distress, though no animals in distress were found, or that they heard someone shouting, but they tested this and it was discovered that you couldn't hear screams or shouts in the house from that part of the barn. What's also interesting to note is that the Grubers are wealthy and had managed to amass quite the fortune despite the post-war financial problems in Germany, and this too raised a lot of questions. Weirdly as well, the night before the murders, Victoria had emptied her entire bank account. Now, Victoria technically owned the farm. When she'd got married, the farm had been signed over to her, with Andreas and her mother still the guardians of the farm. And when her husband, Carl Gabriel, died, she became the sole owner of the farm. So she emptied her bank account and put 700 gold marks in the box at the church. And when they discovered what she'd done, she said that it was money she'd got from missionary work. After the murders, none of the money that she'd removed was found, and her wallet was found empty on her bed. So who killed the Gruber family and Maria Baumgartner? There's numerous theories, but only one really solid suspect. So the first obvious choice, which the police went to first, is robbery. And we know that the Grubers were unpleasant, but they had money. The farmhouse was isolated and it was cold and snowy at the time, so it would make a good target for robbery. But when the house was searched after the murder, police found no paper money, which seems really strange, but they did, however, find a fortune in gold and silver coins and bonds, and they weren't hard to find, so no robber would have left these behind, especially if you've murdered the family, so you have time to spend to look for everything. It did, when they found all of this, though, it did raise the question of how they had come to have so much money in all of these bonds when they were farmers and Germany was going through a bit of a financial crisis. But the rumours in town said that Hinterkaifeck had been used as a weapons depot and that even 2 military aircraft had been stored there, and that would explain some of the weird goings on, and it would also explain how they had all this money. Some years after the murder, a man paid for something with a 1,000-mark bill that was covered in blood, and he alleged that it was from the Hinterkaifeck house. There are 2 sets of brothers who were thought to be suspects if robbery was the motive. The Thaler brothers, who were known naughties. The rumour has it that they had been found by Andreas in the barn and he'd shot at them with an infantry rifle. The previous maid had been harassed by them. They used to appear at her window and ask her for information, and that's who the former maid, who's called Krzyzina Crescents Riga, that's who she suspected. They'd already committed several minor burglaries in the area, and Riga says that Joseph Thaler used to stand at her window and ask her questions about the family, which she wouldn't answer. Joseph Thaler had also claimed to know which family member was sleeping in which room and stated that he knew they had a lot of money. During their conversation, Riga had noticed that there was another person standing nearby, which she believed to be his brother. And according to her statement, Joseph Thaler and the stranger had looked at the machine house and turned their eyes upwards. Riga was warned that the Thaler boys would kill her if they knew that she was talking to the police. And interestingly, there was a rumour that one of the Thaler brothers wanted to divorce his wife and almost did, but she threatened to report him for his crimes at Hinterkaifeck. The other set of brothers that were implicated are the Birchler brothers. Again, Riga suspected these brothers, Anton and Karl Birchler, who Anton had helped with the potato harvest at Hinterkaifeck and therefore knew his way around. Riga said that Birchler often came and talked to her about the Gruber and Gabriel family, and even suggested that he thought they ought to be dead. The maid also emphasised that the farm dog, who was a kind of Spitzy type guard dog, would bark at everyone but never barked at Anton. Riga believed that if Anton and Karl Birchler had committed the murder, they would have done so with George Siegel, who had worked at Hinterkaifeck and knew that the family had a lot of money. Supposedly, Siegel had broken into the home in November 1920 and stolen a number of items, though he denied this. And he did say that he had carved the handle of a mattock while he was working at Hinterkaifeck and knew where the tool should have been kept in the barn passage, and that tool was now missing. These were checked out. There was no evidence to put them at the crime scene, and as I said, there was so much still in the house that robbery was quickly ruled out. So love and revenge is another classic motive for murder. And in this case, there is one rather eccentric link to this, and one that I think, bang on the money. So we're going to do eccentric first. And this theory maintains that Carl Gabriel, Victoria's husband, had in fact not died at Arras as reported, but had returned home to find his wife had had a child with another man and was filled with rage, and so had murdered everyone. After the end of the Second World War, captives from the Schrobenhausen region who were released early from Soviet captivity said they had been sent home by a German-speaking Soviet officer who claimed to be the murderer of Hinterkaifeck. Now, some of these men later either revised or completely recanted their statements, and it seems very unlikely, but many theorised that this guy might be Carl Gabriel, because many said that Gabriel had claimed that he'd wanted to move to Russia. But when this rumour begins to circulate, a lot of his friends who had been with him at Arras said they were there with him when they died, they saw him die, he was definitely dead, and that this theory is ridiculous. The next guy is, if I had to put money on it, this is who I think did it, and that is lovely nearby neighbour Lorenz Schlittenbauer. And he just has the most connections to this. So he gets together with Victoria after the death of his first wife, and he falls out with Andreas quite severely while being squeezed to pay child support for a child he doesn't think is his, which we talked about earlier in the episode. Moreover, as soon as he did start paying child support, Victoria had transferred guardianship over to Andreas. We don't know how much. We never know how much of Andreas's relationship with Victoria she is complicit in. It could be that he has forced himself on her from such an early age that she is now taking part in it and doesn't know anything else, or it could be that he demanded that she change guardianship over to him. He is a very violent man. We know that in the weeks leading up to the murders, Victoria had also asked for the child support payments to be increased. Schlittenbauer had used a key to get into the house, which could make sense if he was in a relationship with Victoria. But if so, why would the family have been so surprised by the disappearance of the key? He touched and moved the bodies, had no problem despite their terrible injuries, which didn't seem to faze him. And the men who were with him thought this was odd, and they were obviously horrified by what they'd seen. Also, the Gruber's dog was obsessed with Schlittenbauer during the days that followed the murder. He barked and growled at him and lunged at him, and Schlittenbauer would later say that's because he had the victim's blood on his shoes. But so I'm assuming with the coroner and his team, and the dog didn't respond to them in that way. But what about all this going on in the attic? The sound of footsteps, the feeling of being watched that everyone had reported. Well, sadly, Schlittenbauer had lost a newborn baby 3 days before the murders, and for the days afterwards, his family and other children could not account for where he was. He certainly wasn't home, and nobody came forward to say that Schlittenbauer had been staying with them. We know that it was snowy out, it was not conditions for sleeping outside, so where had he been? Remember, they found food and human fecal matter in the attic, so someone had been up there. He also knew the family, so he could have found some reason to entice them into the barn one by one, and he knew the layout of the house. He knew where everything was, he knew where all the tools were, and when he was asked who he thought had committed the crimes, he simply said, God's hand was involved here, they were bad people. Which seems like an odd thing to say. The police interviewed him multiple times, but there was no evidence to link him to the crime, and by the time he died in 1941, he had launched and won a few defamation suits. There's a couple of weird things that have come up as well. A woman on her deathbed confessed to a priest that her 2 brothers had killed the family. Police tracked down the one brother that was still living and took him into custody, but he was eventually released and all charges against him dropped. They had no evidence. And in the middle of May 1927, a stranger was said to have stopped a resident of the nearby town at about around midnight. The stranger asked loads of questions about the murder and then shouted that he was the murderer before he ran off into the woods. Now, this stranger has never been identified. In 2007, the police academy took the case on as a cold case and reviewed what they had, although obviously we know that the crime scene had been greatly disturbed and they didn't really have a lot to go on, but they just looked at all the evidence that they had, and though they were unable to conclusively identify the murderer, they did all agree on the same person, and out of respect for that person's family, they have never released his name. They think it's Schlittenbauer. The farm at Hinterkaifeck was damaged by fire a year after the murders, and it was just so unlikely that anyone would want to live out there that the decision was made that it should be torn down completely. As they were pulling it down, they found a mattock so well hidden that it had been missed during numerous searches, some of which involved sniffer dogs. The mattock was made by Andreas Gruber and had a screw sticking out below the blade. So it's not only is this the weapon which had murdered the entire family, but because of the screw sticking out, it meant that this was the only weapon. Rather than remember that they were thinking there might have been a bit of wood with a screw sticking out of it because of the weird star-shaped patterns on Victoria's head. This was in fact unique to this mattock that lived at the farm. The tool had been kept in the tool shed that Andreas had found someone trying to break into, had discovered that someone had been trying to break into. And there, in place of the farm, there is now a memorial to the family. And that is this strange story of Hinterkaifeck. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. Let me know. I want to know what your favourite episode's been so far. Do come and join us over at Patreon, where you can get mini-sodes and extra content, and you can just generally support the podcast. You can email me at themondaynightrevue@gmail.com and find us on social media, TikTok, Instagram and Facebook at The Monday Night Revue. And a big shout out to Hannah, who is our latest subscriber to Patreon. It's lovely to have you there. I hope you're enjoying all the extra content. And until next week, be kind, stay safe, and always check the back seat before you drive.